Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Pulitzer Prize finalist and New York Times bestselling author Barbara Kingsolver returns with a heart-wrenching new novel, Demon Copperhead, an extraordinary reimagining of David Copperfield set in the mountains of southwest Virginia at the onset of the opioid epidemic. In 1850, Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield from his experience as a survivor of institutional poverty and its damages to children, issues just as relevant today. Tapping into Dickens's rage and compassion, Kingsolver paints a rich portrait of contemporary Appalachian life and speaks for a new generation of lost boys in a beautiful, historically cursed place. Barbara Kingsolver is the author of 10 best-selling works of fiction, including the novels Unsheltered, Flight Behavior, The Lacuna, The Poisonwood Bible, Animal Dreams, and The Bean Trees, as well as books of poetry, essays, and nonfiction. The new novel is Demon Copperhead, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Barbara Kingsolver to this week's book show. Thank you so much for being with us. A delight to have you on the program.
I'm delighted to be here.
I have to tell you, I do the show, and people assume that when I'm talking to an author that I fully endorse the book and it's one of my favorites, and I tell them, well, there's a difference between an interview and a review.
That's right.
But
there is.
But let me just say, so there's no confusion about this. This is one of the finest novels I've ever read. And I say that, well, to tell you, so you know, but also just because it's something that I hope people will read and understand, because it's just so important.
Well, thanks. I feel that way, obviously. The subject is really important to me because of where I live, because I'm a Southern Appalachian, and we've gotten a bad deal historically, time and again, but most lately with the opioid epidemic, this is such a bad deal, especially for the kids, a generation of kids growing up here, that I really wanted to tell this story. But as you can imagine, it took me several years to find a way into the story that would really, really get people to look rather than to look away. It's hard. It's hard to look head on at this material. So I had to find a voice and a story that would just really give my readers a reason to turn every page.
That idea of looking as opposed to looking away, which I assume is how you came to Charles Dickens, right? Is how you came to David Copperfield.
I came to Dickens in an unexpected way. As I said, I was turning this over in my head, this question of how to tell a story about these kids who've been abandoned by their society, and I just wasn't finding the way in. And I just, by chance, happened to end up one stormy weekend in November in Bleak House, the house in Broadstairs, England, where Charles Dickens wrote David Copperfield. And the whole story, sort of how I ended up there, it was a bed and breakfast, and I just booked myself in on a whim and kind of met up there with the ghost of Dickens. It was an extraordinary experience. I just was sitting alone in his study at his desk, looking at the stormy sea and feeling his outrage, completely surrounded with like manuscripts and ink and pens and the trappings of his having written David Copperfield, which we know was his story. That was really the story of the humiliations and hardships he himself endured. And I could just feel his anger. And I just heard him say, you let the kid tell the story. Nobody doubts the child. And it just came to me all at once. And I sat there at Charles Dickens' desk and started writing this novel. I said, okay, I'll do it. I will write my David Copperfield, which is this kid, Demon Copperhead. He's nicknamed Copperhead because he has red hair. Right. I just saw him, and I heard him, and he started to talk, and he wouldn't shut up. So there we go.
The start of the second chapter, my thinking here is to put everything in the order of how it happened, give or take certain intervals of a young man skunked out of his skull box, some dots duly connected. But damn, a kid is a terrible thing to be, in charge of nothing. If you get past that and grown, it's easiest to forget about the misery and pretend you knew all along what you were doing. Assuming you've ended up someplace you're proud to be, and if not, easier to forget the whole thing. And that sort of sets us off on this, of the tone of this young man who realizes that he's being taken for a ride.
Yeah, he's no fool. And he's a lot more canny, let's say, and less naive than David Copperfield. It was, I really studied that book, David Copperfield, and I used it as a story map. I just mapped my plot right on top of Dickens's. It was a masterclass in Dickens for me to just study that book and think about how to translate it to my own place and time. But one thing I knew for sure is that kids of now know a lot more than kids did then about the world and about the raw deal they're getting, because they can see on TV what other people have and how other people are appreciated. And in a strange way, being able to see the rest of the world makes kids here feel invisible, because they're not showing up. They're not showing up on the radar either of the social welfare system or, the national stage.
The story of Demon really starts when he's around 10 years old. Bring us to that point of what has happened in his life, of where he is.
Well, he begins, first of all, I got myself born. He is born on the floor of his teenage single mother's single-wide mobile home. It's a very hasty birth, and she's not altogether with it. She's been self-medicating. And there he is. He lands on the floor of this mobile home, and he later on says, in his way, some people might say this makes me the Eagle Scout of trailer trash, not born in the hospital to be taken home to the trailer home, but born in the trailer home. So he grows up kind of, running wild, not very supervised, as kids here can do, which is mostly wonderful, playing in the creek with his best friend Maggot, who lives next door, being raised by his grandmother, because Maggot's mother was equally young and unable to take care of him. And so in some ways, although impoverished, pretty idyllic childhood in a lot of ways, lifting big rocks and being mighty, as he says. But his mother's demons take their toll, and he loses her. First, after enduring a pretty awful stepfather situation, a lot of abuse, he winds up in the foster care system. The first foster home is this tobacco farm where the farmer uses foster boys as unpaid labor, and this is sadly a reality. The foster care system is so overwhelmed that and there are certainly good foster parents, and I know this, and there are plenty of foster parents who are wonderfully motivated, but there are also foster homes that are motivated by the check that they get for these kids and the labor they can get out of them, especially, on a farm. He's living on this farm with this old man that the boys call Creaky. And so on the Creaky farm, they have to bring in hay, they have to work in the tobacco, and they find their own ways to support each other, I guess you would say, as kids, as the blind leading the blind.
And their own things to do. You talk about, there's a section I'm hoping you can read us from the 10th chapter of the novel, and it's basically Demon at a farm party, a PH there, farm as in pharmaceuticals. But you quickly remind us this kid's 10 years old.
Right. He's 10 years old, living with these other boys, and their ringleader is this older boy, the high school football star called Fast Forward that they all revere, and he's kind of in charge here rather than the creaky old man. And he tells Demon that to celebrate his coming, they're going to have a farm party. And Demon thinks, oh boy, cookies or something. Well,
Right.
it's pharmaceutical. So Fast Forward brings in a hat full of pills, and they each take one, and they're sort of escaping from their miserable lives for a minute. There are moments in the book, as there were in David Copperfield, where Demon, the narrator, kind of steps outside. He breaks the fourth wall from time to time, and he talks to you directly because he's telling you this story as an adult looking back on his childhood. So this is one of those times when he's just described the boys sitting on the floor, they're taking pills, they're looking at the moon outside the window, and they have a candle that they swiped from downstairs, and it's putting beautiful, light on the ceiling as they feel the effects of their farm party. So he describes all this, and then he speaks to you, the reader, directly. He says, a 10-year-old getting high on pills, foolish children. This is what we're meant to say. Look at their choices, leading to a life of ruin. But lives are getting lived right now, this hour, down in the dirty cracks between the toothbrushed nighty-nights and the full grocery carts, where those words don't pertain. Children, choices, ruin. That was the labor and materials we were given to work with. An older boy that never knew safety himself, trying to make us feel safe. We had the moon in the window to smile on us for a minute and tell us the world was ours, because all the adults had gone off somewhere and left everything in our hands.
Barbara Kingsolver reading from the new novel, Demon Copperhead. That's such a beautiful section, and I'm interested, did, in your opinion, Dickens have that same view of sort of looking from the outside to his upbringing and childhood?
Well, he did. I mean, when we look at his body of work, so much of it is about the weakness of the social fabric, and sort of just these same questions that were my point of origin. What is the effect of structural poverty on children? In so many ways, so little has changed in 150 years, at least in this country. A recurring theme in this novel is that Demon kind of turns over and has to navigate time and again is the way that the adults in his life have abandoned him. He just feels like the rotten little piece of American pie that everybody wishes would just go away. The junkie's kid, the poor kid, the free lunch kid. And it's not just his parents. His father's dead before he was even born, but it's not just his mother or his terrible stepfather. It's the whole social welfare system, because we learn that, the caseworkers are so underpaid and they have so much more than too much to do. It's hard for them even to remember the names of these kids for whom they are legal guardians. So that's the system we have to work with, and that is real. That is not a fiction. I did a whole lot of research on the DSS and how it works and what the turnover is like, especially in a region like this where the prescription drug abuse problems have left so many kids in the care of the state. There aren't enough resources. But it's not, this is kind of the extreme end of it. But look at every institution that deals with children. Look at education. Look at first grade classrooms where children come home with lists of items that their parents are supposed to buy to send into the classroom. Everything from, chalk and pencils to Kleenex and food for the guinea pig if they have a class guinea pig. Never mind how poorly we pay our public school teachers or our child care workers in preschool children. just the systems themselves. The brick and mortar is, in many cases, literally crumbling. And Demon is very frank about this. I mean, he's, even as a kid, as kids are, he's savvy to who cares and who doesn't. And he says, you treat kids like this, you don't think we're going to grow up and put a brick through your window?
And what he has been called as a child, the names, he brings up the names of use of rednecks and moonshiners, ridge runners, hicks, deplorables. Those are the descriptors. And he keeps talking also about how there isn't so much a sense of getting out of that situation as there is, it seems to me anyway, accepting it and understanding your place with the others who are going through, other children who are going through equally horrible existences.
Right. We have several levels of, let's say, discrimination here. There's on the one hand, there's, he has this sense that kids, wherever they are, kids are on the bottom of the totem pole in terms of power, decision-making, even where we allocate resources. He gets that children are not important. But in addition to that, he lives in a place that the rest of the world considers unimportant. And that is also a fact. And I should know because I live here too. I'm Appalachian, and I have lived my whole life with the kind of stereotypes that the world and the contempt that the world holds for us. When I left Kentucky to go to college, people ridiculed my accent. They, made jokes that I was, what do you know, she's wearing shoes. And it really hasn't gotten much more subtle since then. I live in a beautiful place in a farm in the mountains. And I'm sure city friends don't know how insulting they're being when they ask me, how can you live out there in the middle of nowhere, so far from everything? We hear it all the time. Where we live is nowhere. It is flyover country. I think it's an implicit bias of urban against rural that people don't even recognize or acknowledge, but we see it all the time, and it gets old. It makes people angry. We watch television and we see progressive, educated, forward-thinking people make jokes about Tennessee where, people are having sex with animals or marrying their sisters or whatever. It's just constant. It's one of the most painful things about the global village is that, when you are the invisible member of society looking for yourself reflected in the mainstream media and you're not seeing it. When is the last time you saw a portrait of Appalachian people that was not a joke, a caricature, or a poverty documentary? So that's a big part of this novel as well. Just my effort to represent my people as the nuanced, resilient, interesting people that we are. We are not all one thing. We are not J.D. Vance's horrible relatives in Hillbilly Elegy, which is a book that the rest of the country, ate up with a spoon because it reinforced all the terrible hillbilly stereotypes. I'm trying to counter that with these ecosystems of characters who are all different kinds of people. They might be smart, they might be dumb, they might be heroic, they might be train wrecks, but they're all kinds of people living here dealing with our challenges, the challenges that history has landed in our laps, dealing with them in pretty impressive ways.
Barbara Kingsolver is our guest in this week's book show. The new novel is Demon Copperhead. It is published by Harper. Demon is talking about some of the books that he reads, including Catcher in the Rye, and he says the Charles Dickens one, seriously, the old guy and a foreigner, but Christ Jesus, did he get the picture on kids and orphans getting screwed over and nobody giving a rat's ass?
Yeah, that was my little meta moment when my David Copperfield meets the original David Copperfield. Just a little tiny, moment of kind of an inside joke, a little, fist bump between me and Charles Dickens. It is not at all necessary to have read David Copperfield before you read my novel. Demon Copperhead is its own story, and it stands on its own 2 feet. But if you do read both, you'll see a lot of little private jokes between me and Charles.
I was fascinated. I mean, one of the things that brought me to Dickens when I was very young was the names and these wonderful Dickensian names. What were your thoughts on that in naming your characters, who are often having really nicknames?
It was so much fun because I really did map my story chapter and verse on David Copperfield. I had an Excel file where I'm very scientific about this. I was trained as a scientist before I became a novelist. So I had 66 cells open with a sentence for each chapter. What happens in this chapter of David Copperfield? And then I would write below it what happens in my chapter. And so there's a one-to-one correspondence here between plot events and characters, except I had to, bring them all into my own place and time. So I had to think, what is the modern equivalent of a shoe black factory? Well, it's a stop and go market where there's a meth lab in the back. Child labor in that Victorian times versus child labor in these times. Likewise, each of the characters had to be renamed. So the Macaubers become the Macabres. The terrible stepfather, Murdstone, becomes Stoner. The sort of narcissistic friend, Steerforth, becomes Fast Forward. That's the high school quarterback. Fast Forward is his nickname. I was helped by the fact that in this region, which is maybe a little bit unusual, maybe not, but in southern Appalachia, it's really typical for people to go by nicknames, men especially. It's just about universal. And these nicknames are never kind. It's really funny. I mean, and they show up in the paper every day of the week. I read the obituaries, at least I look at them, and you'll see, Ernest Stubby Walker or, Stumpy. People have these really kind of hilariously unkind nicknames, but that's just, it's as Demon says, you just get used to it. You can buy a beer for your best friend Maggot and neither one of you thinking a thing about it. It's just something that happens. So the fact that we do have colorful nicknames here was helpful to me in naming my characters in a, sort of keeping the comic tradition of Dickensian names.
Angus is a young girl who plays a big part in Demon's life and is really probably the most stable of the characters, right? I think that's safe to say.
I would say so. Mm-hmm. She's kind of the eye of his storm. In many ways, she has her own troubled past. She's an orphan. Her mother, her mother died when she was very young. Well, she's not an orphan, but she lives with her father, who's a football coach, who kind of lost interest in his daughter when, he realized she wasn't going to be a football player. So it's not that she's had an easy life, but somehow she has acquired an attitude of cool, not even acceptance. It's just she has an acceptance of herself that's pretty pivotal to the novel because Demon is continually struggling with the fact that he's never really been seen or loved.
Demon writes, Angus cursing somebody out was not casual. She applied herself. She became a creature of fierce beauty, like a thoroughbred running the Kentucky Derby of cursing. You just had to get out of the way. Your profanity here is, yes, scientifically glorious. It is.
Why, thank you. When my husband is always my first reader, and when he read the first several chapters of the first draft, and he said, now this one is not going to make it into the high school core curriculum.
Yeah, this isn't Poisonwood Bible, no.
And it's not because kids don't know this language. They do. They use it. It's their parents who don't think that
That's
they
right.
know it and use it and want to protect them, which is, another story and too bad. But, well, let me say this. I did dial back Demon's language. Believe it or not, I did. I hit about page 200 of a first draft, and I thought, well, just for curiosity, I'm going to do a search, a file search of how many times Demon, in 200 pages, how many times has he so far dropped the F-bomb? Well, it was 175. So I thought that might be a bit much. Let's see if we can, dial that back to like 75. So I did rein him in, not just his language, but his anger, because while his anger is completely justified, he also has to be. You have to like him. I mean, a book is only as good as its ability to draw the reader in and, invest and care about these characters. And this is only going to work if you love Demon. You have to adore him. You have to be rooting for him and all the terrible things that he goes through and the mistakes you see him making and, want him to stop him from. You have to care. An angry teenage boy is not necessarily easy to love. So that was really a huge project for me to craft his personality and his outrage into a package that's ultimately still someone you want to put your arms around.
There's the seething outrage and love, which gets me to our last point. There's great hope in this book.
There has to be. It's what I do. I can't take you into this dark place without leading you to a place where you can at least see the light. And one thing I'm banking on is the fact that Demon is telling you the story, so he's going to come out of it alive, even though you often doubt it.
Barbara Kingsolver's new novel is Demon Copperhead. It is published by Harper. Barbara Kingsolver, what a delight to speak with you, and thank you so much for the gorgeous novel and for talking to us. It's such a pleasure.
And a pleasure for me, too. Thanks so much. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you very much. Again, Barbara Kingsolver's new novel, Demon Copperhead. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for